works. Okay, I think it's all working. Cool. Okay, wait, now I have to pull up my notes. Okay, so because this is not an in-person meeting, I am gonna try to be looking at the voice text chat channel. So if you have any questions, you can either put the question there, or you can do like a hand raise emote, or just say that you have a question, and I'll try to get to it. I will also be trying to add in moments where like I'll ask if anyone has a question or not, just because I can't like see if someone has their hand up like in the room like we could, you know. Okay, um, so, okay. As anyone who has had like a class with me before knows, I really like Freud a lot, and not specifically just Freud, but psychoanalysis generally. And I have a bit of a rule when it comes to like three different thinkers. Those thinkers are Nietzsche, Marx, and then Freud. And that rule is I will refuse to talk to anyone about them unless they prove to me that they have read them. Because especially with those three, there's a lot of misinformation about them. So I need to like make sure that someone actually has like a grounding in what they're saying and they aren't just parroting a bunch of bullshit. So like Nietzsche, he has tons of like pop philosophy and Instagram quote pages about him, just all talking about the Ubermensch and how great it is, and how terrible the death of God is and all sorts of stuff. Then there's Marx. You have like all of the political propaganda around him from the past several hundred years at this point. That it itself is difficult. And then also there's like he doesn't make it easy to understand him. And then Freud. Freud is a unique one, I think, because there's something very tragic about him because what happens with Freud is that everything that he got right, we just take as like common sense as a given. It's not that revolutionary because like oh we already know this we already accept it. There's nothing like really provocative here. And then all of the stuff that he got wrong, we're just hyper aware of. Or the stuff that seems like really easy to misinterpret, like the psychosexual models, that becomes really highlighted, and everyone just latches onto that and says he's wrong because this is ridiculous. And because I'm prefacing all of this because I want you to really try to let go of everything you think you know about Freud, because that I think is the only way for us to actually like make some progress here. If you're willing to give me a bit of room to lay out what I think is actually revolutionary about him. So to start to go into this, I want you guys to think a little bit about this question. What is the subject in any possible sense? So you can talk about an academic subject, you can talk about like the human subject, you can talk about anything. So does anyone have like some definitions of a subject?
Is it kind of like a perspective? So like subject is like whatever the perspective is most focused on, the most important perspective maybe.
What do you mean by that? Like, could you give an example of that?
Um like for example, if there's like a short if there's a story, the main character is probably the subject
Oh, I
in
see.
many ways.
Or like the subject of like an article or something like that.
Yeah.
Okay. Okay, so that's one. Yeah, so it has to do with focus or like almost the locus of like what is happening there. Does anyone? I see someone is typing. Um, if anyone has anything like any definitions, feel free to just unmute and talk.
We have the subject as in the sense of self.
Yep.
Obvious one.
Yep, that is a good one. Quality subject definition. Subject is what does stuff as opposed to object which has stuff done to it. Yeah, we can talk about like a grammatical subject. We can talk about like the subject predicate distinction. That's a very good one. Does anyone else have any definitions? And you can turn to like certain thinkers to say like these are like this is Kant's definition of a subject or
A
something.
subject is an auto-antonym of itself. It is both an affector and it can be the affected, because you can be
Mm-hmm.
subjected to something and be the subject of something while also being the subject behind uh, something as well. So I would say subject kind of opposes itself in that way.
Yeah, that's a very good one. There's two built into there. Yeah, there's the subject as like a locus of agency, and then also as like this subservient person in like a dominating relationship. You're subjected to. Yeah. Does anyone else have any? Because I have a bunch that we can go through. So. It's looking like no, so I'm going to go ahead and move on, and we're going to, whoops, I have to click on the right thing. Okay, so I have about 10 different definitions of the subject, and some of them have already been said in different ways. So first is the grammatical subject, the one who acts, controls, defines the verb or predicate. Then we have the academic subject, like a collected body of knowledge, which that one's actually quite difficult to find like a good definition for. There's always exceptions with something like this because, knowledge isn't meant to be isolated into certain like bodies or topics. It's broad and expansive. Then there's the monarchical subject, which is like what Daniel just said, the one that is like totally subservient to, in this case, the sovereign, the monarch. And then there is the Cartesian subject, which is defined in the I think, therefore I am, which is defined primarily as like a rational thinking being, and this places knowledge of the self at the forefront of subjectivity. So it's all about knowing that you are a subject. Then there's the subject of liberalism. There's a rational autonomous agent with unalienable natural rights, and then some of them can be given up in a social contract. And it's very similar to the Cartesian subject. It's rational and autonomous and independent, and it's an agent. But there isn't this kind of there's no sociality really in this specific account of the subject. You usually have to give up certain faculties of like being a subject in order to engage in the social. Then there's the economic subject of capitalism, which is very similar to the previous two, just a rational, self-interested actor. And usually there's a kind of hedonism built into it, that they are just using this rationality to fulfill their self-interest within this system. Then we move on to the Kantian subject, which is where it starts to get a little difficult. So there's the dualist conception of the subject that's on the boundary between the noumenal and the phenomenal. And the subject for Kant is a noumenal thing that we have limited access to know about. But it also has that phenomenal aspect that helps to create the phenomenal realm itself through the faculties of the understanding. So the phenomenal part is subject to empirical causality, like a deterministic system, but the noumenal part is unconditioned, so it has free will. So there's this there's this kind of tension between those two parts of it. Then we get to the Hegelian subject, which this also gets a little complicated. I talked a little bit about this in the Hegel meeting I did last semester, but that was a while ago. So the master from the master-slave dialectic is superimposed into the psyche of the slave, which then rules over the body. And in this case, the mind representing the master clings to that thing that's unchanging and perfect, which is pure thought. And that leads it to totally reject the body. So the mind dominates and controls the body. And it's in a negative relation to the body. It doesn't like the body. It's kind of trying to get rid of it. So it can just cling to thought. Then there's the Marxist subject, which is a bundle of social relations. And this is basically just personifications of these economic relations. And this decenters the previous economic subject of capitalism from their position of autonomy to the sum of the forces basically acting upon them. So the actions that kind of are taking place in exchange that proves the subject become primary. The economic actions are primary. And then there's the Nietzschean subject. The subject is an illusory mask that covers over the bundles of drives that is the you. So for Nietzsche, the subject is basically just this mask, and that there's things, there's forces, there's drives behind it, but there's no unity to them. Any kind of unity is just a facade. And so, all of these drives are just different expressions of the same thing, which is the will to power. So these are 10 different definitions of the subject. So I'm going over this because I want to keep this in mind. I kind of want to make sure that we are all updated on where the ideas of the subject are when we get to Freud. Because Freud has a very different take on what the subject is. It's extremely unique. But first, I want to go over some of these questions that will really lead us into specifically psychoanalysis. So, and feel free to comment on any of these. So do dreams have any meaning, or are they just neurological white noise? Do slips of the tongue have any significance? Are we totally conscious of everything that goes on in our psyches? And does our childhood influence what we desire in life? So does anyone have any thoughts on those?
I think because we're talking about like Freud obviously put like a large significance on like the subconscious, right? And like
Yeah.
what is, I guess, under the surface. And I kind of do agree to an extent. A lot of, I guess, things that he said, I'm of the opinion that are like kind of radical, but I think that to this point, I think it makes sense. Like for me, I think dreams are linked to like sort of your experiences and what you have going on, right?
Mhm.
Like what you're just kind of subconsciously thinking about. Like if you're stressful, you might have like a stressful dream, something like that. Or sorry, if you're stressed. And yeah, just for me, I think that these all have merit.
Okay. Anyone else have any thoughts?
I was going to
Yeah.
say,
Personally,
Oh,
sorry, go ahead.
no, go ahead.
Okay. Well, I was just gonna say, I kind of disagree with all this emphasis on the subconscious. I think putting a lot of emphasis on it can often be really problematic because a lot of these things you don't really have a lot of influence or control over. It's really difficult to find consistent patterns in them. A lot of times they're just kind of meaningless. I think also hyper focusing on those things can cause a lot of, how do I say, I guess it could cause a lot of like anxiety or like unnecessary dread, even though it may not necessarily into anything tangible that you can actually fix.
so even though we don't have a lot of controls over these things, you still think they're like meaningless, basically.
Not always, but I think it can be. Like, if we hyper focus on the subconscious and hold it to utmost importance as kind of an absolute, I think there's some problems with that.
Okay, but
That's all I'm trying to say.
okay. So I
But
I
go
mean,
ahead.
I think that there definitely can be like problems with that, but I don't think that necessarily bears on if like any of these like questions are true, like if dreams have meaning, if we're totally conscious of everything that goes on in our psyches. I mean, I think you yourself admit that we aren't totally conscious of everything that goes on in our psyches because we don't have control over everything, like you said, right?
Yeah, I agree with that.
Okay. So anyone else? Oh, there is someone in the chat. I'll read out real quick. So there's work on learning that classifies it into active phase, like when reading a book, and passive phase, like when not actively thinking about something. So I assume that's going to the are we totally conscious of everything that goes on in our psyches? And yeah, I think that there is some connection there. Like with Dhruva's meeting last week on a lot of Eastern thought, specifically like some I think Hinduism or Buddhism, talking about like meditation and attention, basically. I think that he demonstrated very well that there are certain kinds of processes that even seem conscious that we don't actively have like control over in our attention. So like for some of you guys that weren't there, he had us focus on certain shapes that he drew on the wall. And we had to basically keep our focus on one and then try to move our focus without turning our eyes away from the center. We're trying to move our focus to something on our periphery. While we were doing that, we were supposed to be counting. And one of the things I think all of us found is that at some point while we were counting and trying to put our focus on our peripheral vision, there was a point at which we basically kind of, in our conscious awareness, skipped ahead in counting, but we were still counting the whole time. So we were able to turn attention away from something that we thought we were doing consciously. So I think that kind of gets to what the person in the chat said. I think Jordan had something to say, right?
No, I think this ground's been covered.
Okay. Anyone else have anything to say about these questions?
Yeah, I would like to say I generally think a lot of people misinterpret a lot of the things Freud talks about in terms of the subconscious and specifically dreams, and even the whole Freudian slip. I don't think that taking these concepts as like hardline rules of psychology um, is the best concept, and that's what a lot of people tend to do. And I like that hear these questions. I'm going to say I do agree with all of these things. I do think dreams have significance, that slips of the tongue have significance, but not that they always do, that they tend to. And I think that's what Freud comes to agree with as well, at least in Civilization.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, I mean, I think that there are ways I think that the common understanding of like meaning or significance um, betrays almost Freud's answers to these. I'll show in a moment exactly like what Freud kind of thinks of these through certain interpretive lenses that he has. Um, but I think that our common understanding of meaning, like a lot of people think about like dreams having meaning, like, oh, your unconscious is trying to tell you something. And it's like that's not what Freud means by it having meaning, you know. But no, okay, that's good. Anyone else have anything before we want to move on?
I'm not sure if this is totally related. I don't know if anyone, probably some people here have seen like BoJack Horseman. I think one of like the central themes of this show was that it doesn't really matter if you're like one of the things I think it was what's her name? I can't believe I forgot. It was something when oh Diane. It's either Diane or Diana. But she said something about how like it doesn't really matter, like everything you are just the things that you do. Like it was in response to a question of like, am I a good person deep down, even though I do all these messed up things? And her response was, no, everything you are is just what you do.
Yeah.
The deep down doesn't really matter. Is that
Yeah.
kind of related to this, or?
I don't know, but it's a very Nietzschean way of analyzing that. Because he would be very critical that there's anything like behind, the mask that we put on. It's just all external based on our actions. But okay, unless anyone has anything else to say, we could move on. Does anyone? Speak now or forever hold your peace. Okay, we're gonna move on. So I want to go through some of these popular Freudian ideas first. And these are things that generally most people accept, even within like psychology. So first, the very popular one lately is unconscious bias, usually in terms of like racial bias, but there's also like we can have other biases, unconscious associations between things. That is totally rooted in the idea that we have an unconscious, which is part of the Freudian revolution of psychology. Before that, there was no coherent model of like an unconscious. So then there's also the fact that like childhood is psychologically important. That seems very self-evident to us now, but that wasn't always the case. A lot of people didn't necessarily think that childhood was really important. I mean, this kind of tangentially, I think, shows this, but like a lot of people thought that like babies couldn't feel pain up until very recently. And it's like I think that in that there's a certain kind of dismissal of children's experiences as being important for later on. Because it's like, oh, they're just going to forget it all. It's not going to leave any kind of lasting impact. And it probably isn't relevant. And I think we do still carry a certain kind of dismissiveness towards children and their experiences in this. So then there's also the idea that like words and actions can carry a deeper meaning behind them. That was intended by the speaker. Then there's also defense mechanisms. We hear this a lot, that the psyche has various ways of dealing with potentially dangerous experiences. And there's, I think, 5 different ones I have written down here that I can go through. So the first is repression. So when a feeling is hidden and forced from the consciousness to the unconscious because it's seen as socially unacceptable, or you just aren't able to fulfill that kind of desire. So then there's regression, which is falling back to an earlier state of mental/physical development, seen as like less demanding and safer. I think a good example of this is like sometimes, usually this happens in sitcoms, I think, where like one of the characters encounters like a really scary person or some kind of experience, and they just kind of shrink. And then sometimes they'll say something like, mommy, or like something like that. It's like desiring that kind of parental like comfort that they can provide. I think that that's an example of regression. There's also projection, possessing a feeling that is deemed as socially unacceptable, and instead of facing it, that feeling or unconscious urge is seen in the actions of other people. So a lot of this is like if a lot of people use projection as a way to get past like their own deficiencies. They see, oh, everyone else is annoying or something like that when they're actually the ones annoying. My favorite one, reaction formation, acting in the opposite way that the unconscious instructs a person to behave. And for example, if a wife is infatuated with a man who's not her husband, reaction formation may cause her to, rather than cheat, become obsessed with showing her husband signs of love and affection. I think of this almost as a way of trying to convince you that you do believe like the thing, that you secretly feel like you don't. And then the last one, sublimation. This is generally considered to be the most acceptable of them. And it's basically where you take the libido and you turn that libidinal energy towards basically non-sexual things. So you can say there's a lot of talk that like artists will sublimate their sexual desires to put it towards their artistic projects. So those are the defense mechanisms. Then Freud was really the first person to give a clear and comprehensive definition of narcissism. I'm not going to go over it now, but if you are interested, I think he has a paper called On Narcissism where he talks about this. And of course, we talk a lot about people like being narcissists just in our society. One of the biggest ones I think that is like undeniable that like this is a really important contribution and people don't really attribute it to Freud and they really need to. It's the effectiveness of talk therapy. I think it was in the case study Anna O where actually the term talk therapy was coined by that patient. And basically like his whole therapeutic technique was he would basically sit like with someone, they would be lying down on a couch, and he would try to get them to relax, and basically they would do free association. So the patient would just talk and talk about whatever pops up in their mind, any kind of connections, and the analyst will sometimes intervene and ask a certain kind of question or offer some interpretation. Sometimes the patient will ask the analyst for that, but it's kind of this not quite dialogue, but there's a kind of back and forth that goes on there. And the fact that this is effective is, I think, showing that there's a lot more to Freudian ideas than we really think. Because, like, if we think about it, if we are really, like, just this, like, if we go down, like, just the pure, like, neuroscience route, if we are just totally, like, this, like, a biological computer-like thing, why is it that talking about our problems helps? It's like, why can that actually like cure things? It's really kind of baffling, and it's hard to answer that kind of question. And then also, Freud was really committed to a scientific analysis of things. He thought what he was doing was a science. So he really kind of introduced the idea that the human psyche can be scientifically analyzed and that follows certain kind of rules and patterns. So let me see. I do have a ping. I'm just making sure. Okay, no, it's unrelated. Cool. Okay, so now these are a couple features of Freud's thought. So there's first is determinism, and this is a really important one. So he is definitely a determinist, and this is actually how he comes to the idea of an unconscious in the first place. Because for two reasons. First, he dealt with a lot of patients that had extreme psychosomatic symptoms, which he basically thought that there had to be something that was causing these. And it clearly wasn't the fact that, like, it wasn't a product of their conscious mind. So there had to be something within their psyche that was causing these symptoms. And then the second one is dreams. Because for him, there can't be anything like random, because he believes in a kind of like physical determinism. So the fact that dreams exist at all in like some kind of like narrative at all shows that there's something that's causing it. I mean, and he would say that a lot of it comes down to the experiences that you had the day before. But that means that there has to be some part of the psyche that we are not aware of that is causing this, because otherwise we would know like what was causing these dreams. You know, we'd be more aware of the whole dream process. So there has to be something that is kind of inside of us that we don't really have access to. So that's how he gets to the unconscious. And that's the big influence of his determinism. Then we move on to the kind of scientific outlook he had. So he really believed that he was conducting a scientific project. And he thought that his work analyzing the psychological aspect of the psychosomatic subject could be backed up later on by biology or neuroscience. Except instead of from the side of psychology, it would be from the side of those different attitudes, the somatic side of the subject. Because the term psychosomatic means mind and body, basically. So he thinks that all of these things that are happening, all of these like psychological symptoms that his patients are exhibiting, are products of a certain kind of psychical and physical relationship that's happening, and that you can understand what's going on from either end. It's just he thought that our science wasn't quite able to do it on that end yet. So he created psychoanalysis to be able to try to do it. Then the talking cure, which I already did talk about. So I will say, though, he did actually initially start therapy using hypnosis. And he very quickly kind of moved away from that because he felt that there was a lot of insufficiencies with it, to turn to something more conversational. But he basically, the analysis is supposed to focus on those symptoms, those things that kind of express themselves that we aren't quite sure what's causing them or what they mean, things like that. And the ultimate goal is to bring the repressed content of our psyches back into conscious awareness. And then there's the whole sexuality and infantile sexuality thing. So if you know anything about Freud, which I've already told you to get rid of, but if you didn't, he's very famously known for his emphasis on sex. But this is also something that not many people know, is that he defines sexuality extremely differently from the common usage of it. He basically redefined it to cover any form of pleasure which is or can be derived from the body. So he would say eating and the pleasure that you get from trying different kinds of foods is sexual. He would actually say like using the restroom in a lot of ways is sexual. That's why he has like the anal stage in his psychosexual model. Like anything that basically any kind of experience that's psychologically significant, or what he would say is cathected, is sexual. So this obviously changes like a lot that we think about in terms of his sexuality, not his sexuality, but how he talks about sexuality, and particularly the Oedipal complex. So we'll get to that in a moment. But this has a lot of implications for infants and young children, because what was thought at the time is that they didn't have any sexual desires, and that only came about basically once they reached puberty. That's where those desires start to come. But he emphasized that they do have sexual desires, which was extremely controversial at his time. Like he was ostracized in a lot of ways for that kind of claim. And it's also a bit of like a taboo topic today to talk about like children's sexuality. But basically, he would argue that infantile sexuality is a very unformed kind of sexuality, because adults, we have a lot of different layers of repression that basically hone in and define our desires in more discrete terms. For infants, they haven't quite internalized all of those social modes of repression, so it's much more of just this kind of general expression for desire for pleasure. And this will have a lot of implications with the Oedipal complex in a moment. But he refers to this kind of sexual energy that's expressed as the libido or libidinal energy. And this is the primary drive that he attributes things to, until he gets on to the death drive, which comes a bit later. And only then, once he gets to the death drive, is he actually able, or is he willing to break from the kind of strict scientific rigor that he thinks his project has. And then the last thing is that a lot of people seem to have this impression that Freud's kind of tripartite model of the psyche, which is superego, ego, and id, is like internalized to us, like it's essential, like we're born with it. And that's not true. That forms in the Oedipal complex. So this is why I say he's an anti-essentialist in this way. He doesn't think that there's any kind of psychological features that we are born with, other than basically just kind of general desire or like the want for pleasure. He doesn't think that there's any structural features that are born with us. Okay. Any questions about any of this?
Yeah, where can I find out more about Freud's like the physical determinism? Because you mentioned that, and that's very interesting to me, but not something that I really knew about him.
Yeah, so I don't think he ever writes specifically about the like his like materialist or determinist kind of perspective on it. If you want to see how that like informs his work, I think the best way to do it would be looking at the interpretation of dreams. I've only read selections of it, but I've also read the shorter kind of work that's meant to be a summary of it called On Dreams, where he kind of goes through and lays out basically his perspective on dreams. But I think that would be a good place probably where you could see the influences of that kind of determinism informing how he builds like up to his understanding of dreams. I think that would probably be the best way. But remember, he is trying to do this project from the psychological side of it, not the somatic side of it. So he's not really going to be talking too much about the somatic, unfortunately. So any other questions? Okay. Let me get rid of this notification real quick. Okay. Let's move on. So now for the Oedipal complex. So this is also very poorly understood generally. So like I said with infantile sexuality, it's very unfocused, very unrefined, very undefined. So it's just kind of a general like desire for pleasure. And for the infant, the main source of that pleasure is the mother, because the mother is the one that takes care of them. For Freud, this is a biological mother. Lacan would say mother is kind of a certain role that is fulfilled that can be fulfilled by either like the mother or the father or any kind of caretaker. For Lacan, it's just about being able to fulfill the infant's desires. But for Freud, it is a biological thing. So they have general desire for their mother and the pleasure that their mother can provide via fulfilling the infant's needs. Then the father sees this desire, and because adults have a stricter, more defined understanding of sexuality, the father permits most of the infant's desires, except for what we understand as the explicit sexual kind of desire. And it's because that is exclusive to the mother and the father. They're the only ones in the family that are allowed to have sexual desire for each other. The infant isn't allowed. So basically, the father threatens the infant with castration to stop that desire. Great father. But this threat causes the infant to turn that desire inwards and repress it. So the incest taboo here is the thing that actually first forms the unconscious. That initial repression is what makes the id distinct and unconscious, which is the source of desire. And then also the internalization of that threat of castration from the father is what creates the superego, which tries to negate the libidinal desires of the id. And then to mediate between those two, the ego is formed, which deals with what is called the reality principle, which is basically trying to get as much pleasure as possible with as little pain as possible, because the basically just trying to balance the demands of both, which is a hard job, I bet. So that's the idea behind the Oedipal complex. It's a little bit more complicated than that. If you want to know more, I think, wait, let me pull up my Freud anthology. I know that there is one called the ego and the id, and I think that there is one specifically called the Oedipal complex. Let me just make sure. If you are interested in getting into actually reading Freud, I really recommend Freud Reader by Peter Gay. And then also, this is great, but at Half Price Books, there's always a ton of Freud stuff. Sometimes in the philosophy section, sometimes in the psychology section. Some will have a specific shelf for Freud, but I've gotten a lot of different Freud texts just from there. So it doesn't look like there's a specific one called the Oedipus complex. There is one called the dissolution of the Oedipus complex, but there is one essay called the ego and the id, and I believe that would probably be the best way or the best source for this. So any questions about the Oedipus complex?
Yeah, I'll speak.
Okay.
I quite like a lot of Freud's ideas, again, just for what they point out in terms of human development. Some of his actual interpretations as he lays them out are a little,
Yeah.
His era. But in terms of the one thing I don't like about the Oedipus and the Electra complex is the names, because he really doesn't understand the stories.
Yeah.
Especially aligning with the Nietzschean view of how to read Greek tragedy. Like, this name misses the mark, man. It does. First off, it doesn't align with the story because Oedipus didn't want it.
No,
But
yeah.
that's just a little thing that always bugs me. Is everyone's like, "Oh man, Oedipus, Freud." Like, no, separate Sophocles from Freud, please. Sophocles is writing about the human being as a phenomenon, pretty much.
Well, I mean, they are still deterministic. I heard a rumor, right, that part of the reason that the name was attributed is because, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, this is just a rumor that I heard, that essentially the idea behind naming it that is Freud was like, oh, nobody is determinist. Most people are not determinists nowadays. Why does Oedipus strike fear in us?
Yeah.
Yeah, I don't know.
Why does the story of Oedipus, why is it so hard-hitting? It's because it's deterministic. It's because it reminds us of this ultimately deterministic fact of childhood.
I don't know if Freud's determinism really feels like a heavy-handed way to talk about people falling into patterns, but then again, I haven't read everything that Freud has ever written, so I could be entirely wrong about that. And if that is the case, I don't know about that anecdote. That's a pretty funny anecdote, but in terms of if that's the truth, I'm not going to argue against Freud's position because I don't know it well enough to say anything on it. But I think it's interesting, so thank you for bringing that up. I'll have to look into that.
Yeah, and then also on that pattern point, we'll see in a moment when we get to the death drive, but there is a heavy focus on repetition in a lot of his work, particularly his later work. Um, because for most of his like active life, he mostly focused on the pleasure principle because that's what he thought he could like scientifically verify or would be verifiable. Um, but later on, he starts to see these certain experiences that we'll talk about in a moment that drive him to say that there's also something else going on, and repetition is one of the things that leads him to that. So anything else that we want to talk about? Oh, you're a little quiet. I can barely hear you, Greg.
Yes, well, he's. I got a quick question, I guess. So are there like I guess neo-Freudian interpretations of this? Because like I don't know, to me the whole incest thing, and I guess most other people would also find it quite absurd.
Mhm.
So I was wondering if there's maybe like a different interpretation or kind of like an alternate way to approach kind of the same thing.
Yeah,
Uh,
there are neo-Freudian interpretations, and there are neo-Freudians out there. Generally, they do try to update some of the like the sexuality stuff, but they also try to like keep some of it there. Like I think because it is really vital to Freud's theory. Like you can't get rid of it. They do try to update it, I think, in ways that are I don't know a whole lot about it, but I think that it's somewhat unfaithful to Freud. But actually, I do want to ask you a question because why is it that you think that there's something kind of ridiculous about this? Because when I first heard about like what the actual Oedipus complex was like, I was like, oh, that makes a lot more sense. Like I don't think it's as crazy as it sounds.
I guess in a lot of ways I just don't really see it. It's not something that I can like visualize or like connect to any experiences, if that makes any sense.
Okay, yeah, all right. So Greg, you had something. Is your microphone working now?
is it working?
Mm-hmm. Yep.
Okay, nice. Uh, yeah, I was wondering like how the like where the fathers define sexual like confined or constrained sexual desire in specific terms towards the mother comes from. Like how is it that already like where does this initial family structure come from? Is there a genealogy of that, or does he just like take it for granted that it exists and therefore the infant is molded in that way? Uh,
Yeah.
but
Oh
also
yeah, go ahead.
yeah, I'll just ask like um actually never mind. I forgot the second part of the question. So
Okay, let me know if you remember it. But so in terms, so do you
yeah.
mean like, does he explain why it is that the family is structured this way, or like, is it just that like he
It,
accepts it like this?
well, I'm just wondering because how is it that adults have these um fully developed like demarcation of their sexual desire if the origins of that demarcation are the adults in themselves.
I
Um,
see. Okay. Yeah,
yeah.
so this gets into some stuff I don't know as well. I know that he does talk about this, but he talks about this in Totem and Taboo. And then also, I think in Civilization, it's Discontents, but less so there. And basically, oh man, I only know this from a secondary source, from Marcuse. But basically, oh, I don't think I have enough knowledge to be able to piece it together faithfully.
It
But that would be probably the best place to go to, Totem and Taboo.
Okay.
I think
And
I might remember
you
a little
remember?
bit from
Okay.
Civilization and its discontents. I
Okay.
mean, essentially, like he talks about like that sort of that Oedipal structure. I mean, it's part of how society is formed. Essentially, he's not super detailed on it, and my memory is lacking. But if I recall, he goes into how society asks us to, or essentially forces us to repress our own desires and creates the family structure,
Hmm.
which then imposes itself further on individuals in this way.
Yeah, and just
I
to kind of
see.
build on that a little bit, there's also this is from Totem and Taboo, where basically there's a certain kind of there's the big question of like how does like this kind of repression get kicked off is the question of primal repression. And basically Freud's answer is that there's this kind of, and I don't like this answer at all, but there's this kind of like mythological formation that occurs through like primitive societies, that basically what happens is there's like the father, like authoritarian tyrant father, and then basically like the sons of the father rebel and kill him, but then through that they feel guilt for doing that. And then that is what the first repression comes from. And then they kind of make this like almost like posthumous like kind of cult of personality around the father
Ah,
out of that guilt, and then
that's
that kind of progresses
that's
onwards.
that's so weird. Okay,
Yes,
but
it
I
is.
remember the question.
Okay.
So the part where the father threatens with castration. I mean, I don't understand this to be like literally castration in most instances.
Hmm.
But just how does that look in like a normal unfolding of a childhood? Like, well, it's very abstract. Like I don't get it.
Yeah.
Um,
You didn't experience this?
um, no, yeah, I think that also gets a bit to Daniel's comment that he typed, which is the problem of like the baby like fearing castration. I think that that is where it starts to get a bit difficult to really conceptualize, because like it's hard to imagine that the baby yet has the faculties to understand like a threat, like a bodily threat yet, because like all that they
especially
know
one
really.
that's so specific. And if it's not phrased or like presented in such a specific form,
Yeah, no, it is
like
very
yeah,
defined in that route. No,
yeah.
I do think that there is some problems with that. I think Lacan later on starts to deal with some of those problems, though. That's one of the reasons I like him more than Freud. Um,
Hmm,
but yeah, okay.
okay.
Any other questions? Okay. Now for the next slide.
Actually, I did have a thought, but
Yeah, go
I'll
for it.
come back to it. I
No, no,
lost
it's
it.
fine. Go for
No,
it.
no, I lost it. I'll come back to it.
Oh, okay, okay. So,
Um,
oh, were you gonna
sorry.
say? Okay. So, uh, dream interpretation now. So I was gonna play this video, but I don't want to run out of time because we're already halfway through. And it's like 10 minutes, so I'd just rather get into the meat of it. But if you are interested, I'll post this link in the chat. And this is time stamped basically of this guy sharing his dream to a trained psychoanalyst, and you can basically see it's not a full dream interpretation, but the analyst goes through and explains some of the things, and basically gets feedback on it. So it's a very interesting podcast episode. It's just an interview with the psychoanalyst for most of it, but nope.
Hey there,
Nope, there we go. Okay. Dreams. So Freud makes an important distinction between the manifest content of dreams and the latent content. So manifest content is that which appears to you like in the actual experience of the dream. It's the thing that's like most surface level. Latent content is what's below that, the actual connections beneath it that make up the manifest content. Um, so, also, we need to talk a little bit about meaning of dreams. I mentioned this a bit earlier, but when we talk about meaning, we don't mean that it's like a message that someone would send to us, like our unconscious is trying to communicate something dire to us. Because that implies that there's too much intent behind it. There's no intent. It's just like a deterministic process here. It's just the expression of the unconscious processes or desires that are able to be expressed into the conscious mind, because while you're asleep, Freud says that the barrier between the conscious and unconscious is weakened, so things can start to kind of go between them. Um, okay, so let's see. So for Freud, dreams are supposed to satisfy the wishes or desires that we had during the day but were unable to fulfill. The dream presents us with a situation in which that wish or desire has already been fulfilled to satiate it. Importantly, it isn't a fantasy of the actual act of fulfillment. It's already done in the dream. So that way, it gets around kind of some of the problems of like, oh, like you have parts of the dream where you haven't yet fulfilled that wish. It's totally fulfilled in already in the dream. Um, and the goal of this is basically to nullify any disruptions that an unfulfilled wish would have in the person's sleep. So dreams actually enable us to be able to sleep. Otherwise, those wishes or desires that are unfulfilled would keep us awake, basically. Like if you think about like someone who's like really hungry, like it's going to be really hard to sleep when they have that kind of hunger. It will constantly like snap them out of it, you know. So a dream, what would happen is it would be able to imagine a situation where that desire is satisfied, so that way they're actually able to carry on with it. So let's see. Yeah, so wishes are generally generated by the pleasure principle. So and then there's a couple of processes that occur in dream formation. So there's censorship, there's condensation, and displacement. Those are the three I want to talk about. So censorship is something that basically forcibly distorts the wishes that your unconscious is expressing. And what happens is that and this really comes with more adult dreams. When you're a younger child, this doesn't occur as much, because what happens is when you're expressing a certain wish, especially if it's something that's kind of taboo, you also alongside that are expressing like the guilt about having that desire in the first place. So that you're kind of expressing something that's positive, but in the same move, you're expressing something that's trying to negate it. So it ends up distorting the expression of that in the manifest content of the dream. It isn't quite clear what it is. It requires a lot of interpretation to figure out what is the desire and what's the corresponding thing that's trying to negate it, the censorship of it. So an example would be like desires to be unfaithful to a monogamous partner. We have the desire, but we might also have guilt associated with fulfilling that desire. So both get expressed, and that censors things. And the reason why it's usually simpler for children, they don't have this kind of censorship, is because they haven't internalized those social ideas of like shame or guilt yet. So there's a lot less censorship that happens. As they grow up, there more and more happens. But Freud says that like these dreams of children are a lot clearer and easier to interpret because they don't have that kind of censorship. And then condensation is when multiple dream contents are compressed and expressed into one dream. Multiple wishes, multiple desires, all become wound together and expressed as one. Then displacement is when that manifest content doesn't resemble the latent content. So it's a product of censorship. It's kind of a more technical expression for what happens on the manifest content where the latent content is undergoing censorship. Any questions about this? Because we are going to actually do, we're going to go over a dream interpretation that I did next. So
what does he say about nightmares?
Yeah, okay. So he will say that there are certain so it totally depends on the content of the nightmare. He will say that there are certain ways that nightmares can fulfill wishes. And like unpleasant dreams can fulfill wishes. So like in the interpretation of dreams, he actually gives this example of he was telling one of his patients this theory that dreams are basically trying to satiate desires or wishes. And she says, no, that's ridiculous. I don't believe it. And then the next night she has a dream that seems to contradict Freud's idea. It's like it was a very unpleasant dream. There's no desires being fulfilled in it. But Freud says the desire that was fulfilled in that dream was the desire you had for me to be wrong.
That's such a dickhead thing to say.
Well, no, but like this is really important too, because he doesn't just care about the content of the dreams. He cares about the form of them as well. So there's like another example that he had of a patient, and she had a dream where she basically she was pregnant, and then when it came time to figure out like who the father was, the dream started to kind of become hazy, and she lost focus, and then it stopped. And what Freud interpreted that as is, and he ended up being right about the facts of this at least, is that she ended up actually being very sexually promiscuous. So what that form of the dream was expressing, the uncertainty in the form, was the uncertainty for which of her partners was going to be the father of the child in the dream. Sorry, I just had to take a drink. Okay, so any more questions about that?
Okay, but that. Oh wait, sorry. Go ahead.
Oh, you're good. Does Freud ever comment on lucid dreaming at all?
Oh, I have no idea. That's a really good question, though. He might at some point. I'm not sure if that was really on his radar as much, though. So
yeah, that's what I was thinking too. Yeah.
Yeah, but no, that's a good question. I will guarantee you, if you like go on JSTOR and you search up like psychoanalysis and lucid dreaming, you'll probably find some stuff on there. That'd be really interesting to look at, though.
Yeah, I think I'm gonna do that.
Yeah. Okay. And then Jan had another question, right?
Well, it seems like he has he has a lot of examples of like dreams themselves fulfilling wishes, and he's just applying that to like a hyper specific example of a nightmare. So like because I don't know, like the dream I told you about, the one where the elevator cable snapped. Like
Oh yeah.
what wish does that fulfill of mine?
Yeah, so this is where it starts to, and you'll see exactly kind of what it takes to actually interpret a dream in a moment. But it's really hard to just like take the manifest content and then interpret in the latent content without sitting down with the person and basically having like a really long conversation about like what all of these like little elements mean to you. Because Freud talks about that like there are certain kinds of like symbolism that are kind of cultural and that come into our consciousness through like the superego and the repression that we feel. But there's also different kinds of symbols that we ourselves create for ourselves, certain things that are significant to us. So you can't just interpret a dream based on like what is the cultural consciousness is. You have to have a really strong connection with your patient to be able to actually go through and talk about it all. So unfortunately, I can't give you like a good interpretation of what that dream is. And it's also really important that you do it pretty soon to when you had it, because a lot of the questions will be about like the day before, like what were you doing? And that usually gets forgotten pretty quick. So any other
I
questions?
have something for. Yeah, I have a comment on the whole nightmare thing.
Mm-hmm.
Like maybe a nightmare could be like a satiation for the desire of of either certainty or like kind of a satiation of dread. Because if you're like dreading something and you're dreading something, you're dreading something, you go to sleep and you have a dream of like the worst possible outcome of what you're dreading, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like the process of dreading is kind of like psychologically or probably even like physically preparing for like a bad outcome.
Yeah,
So in
actually,
that sense, you're like making it productive in a way.
no, there actually he does talk about anxiety dreams once you get to beyond the pleasure principle, and I will bring up what he thinks about anxiety, fear, and fright. That will have a lot to say about that. But unless there's anything else, we can go ahead and move on. So, any other questions, comments?
Nah.
Okay. So now, okay. So this is a dream that my friend's younger sister gave me. And I ended up being able to actually talk with her for a long time about this. So she said, my graphic design class got canceled, so I had to join another class where I made deliveries to other teachers. I dropped off a magenta Keurig machine to my pre-cal teacher, who gave me a disappointed look. I just walked out awkwardly, and the delivery teacher made eye contact with me and devoured a bright pink bath bomb. He claimed it was an Allegra smoothie, then shrugged. Okay, so what stands out to you about this dream? If you were talking with this person, what would you ask?
Very
When's the last time you had
colorful.
coffee?
Okay, so I heard last time you had coffee. Okay. What else is there?
Very colorful.
What was that? Very colorful?
Yeah, a lot of vibrant colors, pink, bright pink, purple.
Yeah, that's true.
Might ask what the significance of those are. Smoothie as well. Like smoothies are generally pink and purple because they're like fruits.
Yeah, no,
I would
those are
immediately accuse them of having problems with authority.
interesting. Okay, because of the relationship with the pre-cal teacher there, or
Yeah.
okay,
It's
Along
a
the
general go-to for conversations for me.
okay. Anything else?
Definitely along those same lines. I think the first thing I would ask is like, what is your relationship with like the teacher? Like, do you think like they're sort of like, an oppressive like whatever teacher? Do you like them? Are they like a pain in your ass? Like, what is your professor with, or what is your relationship with them?
Yeah. Okay. So that was one of the kind of the first questions I asked. So first I asked about what their day was like before, and then if they have any particular if there are any particular events surrounding the classes that she mentioned, the coffee, or her teachers. And she said there wasn't really anything significant about the day. Her graphic design teacher has been out for 2 weeks with COVID, but as far as coffee goes, the teacher she's planning to be an aide for next year was trying to convince her to do more, to do so with coffee as a bonus. And then she said she didn't know why her pre-cal teacher was there. So I asked about the feelings towards her pre-cal teacher. And she said that her pre-cal teacher makes her slightly uncomfortable, but she doesn't feel strongly about him. And then I also asked about the color pink and the bath bombs. She said she likes pink. And let's see, where's the bath bombs? Oh, she didn't respond to that. And then I asked about the graphic design class. She said it's her favorite class most days. Without the teacher, they're just stuck in the cafeteria for about half the time. The other half, they're in the design lab, but didn't have an assignment, so she mostly worked on personal projects and a fake memorial card for the teacher. Forgot about that part. Let's see. So then I asked if she likes coffee or Keurig, and then what she thinks of magenta. She said she's never had a good experience with Keurig coffee. She doesn't drink it often, but she likes coffee. And she said her calculator is magenta. So I want to. Does anyone have any connections with this yet? Any ideas?
I mean, I've done a lot of dreaming. I keep a journal and stuff, and one of the things I've noticed is like a lot of the things are pretty superficial. Like, you know what I mean? Like, it's not. And so, for instance, like, yeah, a teacher mentioning coffee, the calculator being magenta, that teacher being delivered a coffee machine that was magenta. It's these sort of like superficial things that are just going to kind of be reminiscent symbols of the day before or something like that.
Yeah, absolutely. That's the exact connection I made. The magenta Keurig machine to the pre-cal teacher in the class that she uses a magenta calculator with. And that same teacher makes her uncomfortable, and in the dream, he gave her a disappointing look. So does anyone else have anything to add about that before I give you more information? Okay, more information it is. So I asked what makes her uncomfortable about the pre-cal teacher. Did I phrase that right? Yeah, I think so. She said he really liked my siblings, so it's maybe not him, but the expectations he has for me. I asked if she interacted at all with him the previous day. She said she asked a couple questions in class. Other than that, no. I asked what kind of questions. Were they clarifying questions or otherwise? She said mostly clarifying, yes. Oh, I remembered that I didn't do my pre-cal homework last night. And I responded with, well, what motivated the question asking? And were the questions you were asking easy or hard? How did not doing your homework make you feel in class? And this is that particular set of questions I asked, I think shows something that's really important when you're dealing with trying to interpret a dream, which is that you don't really want to ask a really leading question because you want them to kind of give you as much information as possible without filtering it out. So what I was wondering is, like, was she confused about something, and that's what motivated the question. But I had to ask what motivated the question asking, and then also if you ever have to ask kind of a sort of leading question just for sake of clarity, I usually try to ask an opposing question to it, an or option. So I asked, like, were the questions you were asking easy or hard? Or like, did you feel this way about this experience, or did you feel a different way? Something like that. So then to those questions, she said she was confused because she was incorrectly storing values in her calculator, and she had to ask what she was doing wrong. I said, I feel like that has something to do with the disappointing look he gave you in your dream. Perhaps you internalized the expectations you feel like he has for you, which made you think he would be disappointed by you having difficulty with your calculator. And then I asked, what did she think about that? And she thought that sounded about right. And another thing you have to make sure you're doing is you don't just like create conclusions without their feedback, because it's really important that they tell you if they think that's right, if they think it's wrong, because ultimately you're always going to be working with limited information. They might, and by giving a kind of a provisionary conclusion, you can potentially suss out more information from them that they wouldn't have offered just by like asking certain questions. You have to be really strategic about it. So then I asked if she had any views on smoothies, and clarified Allegra as in the medicine. And it was, and then she said when she was little, she really liked making smoothies, but not drinking them, which was really funny. And then I asked what she liked about making them, and she said she got to use the blender. And then, okay, this is a connection that I made, but didn't end up going anywhere. And I asked, isn't Blender a graphic design program? She said it is, but not one we use. And I asked if she had any experience outside of class with it, just to see if like there's any kind of like strong feelings towards anything that could make that a potential connection. She said she never really had the chance to use it. She's seen it before though, and that she said she's mostly indifferent to like trying to use it. So then I continued on with the blender question, and I asked what she thinks she liked about the blender as a kid, and she said, I think I liked that my parents let me do it on my own. So I asked, actually, what would you ask next? Any ideas or any kind of connections that you think you've made?
I would ask, what kind of smoothies did she make usually?
Oh, that's a
The
good
blender.
question. Yeah, I didn't think about that one actually. Good. Anything else?
Well, I feel like it'd be kind of a leading question, but like maybe did she think that the teacher was taking away her agency because he's consuming the smoothie? Um, or maybe I don't know.
Yeah, that's a good one too. Um, I asked, wait, fuck, I have to scroll back down. Okay, I asked, in the dream where you were delivering coffee, were you doing that alone? Um, and she said I went up the stairs with a group of kids and the teacher, but I was the only one who went into the pre-cal class. Um, and I told her I think there's a possible connection between going alone and that smoothie. And then I asked for her thoughts on it. Um, and she said that she could see that being the case. Um, and then the last thing I did was inquire into the bath bomb because we didn't really follow up too much on that. And she said, I feel like bath bombs are more trouble than they're worth. They usually smell nice, but the tub stains are a lot to deal with. Um, I've asked how many times she's tried them, how long ago. She said she got a couple as a birthday gift years ago. And I asked if that was a significant birthday. She said she doesn't remember anything other than the bath bombs about it. And then I asked if she used them for special occasions. She didn't think so. Then we returned back to pink. The only association she had with pink was Pepto-Bismol. And then I think that was about where I stopped because I couldn't get any more from it. She had also mentioned though that she dyed her hair pink during a particularly nasty depression spike. So I don't know. What do you guys think about it? That's all the information I have to offer. So any thoughts, any interpretations you guys would like to offer?
When is this Allegra smoothie? Is that like Allegra as in the allergy medicine?
Yes, the allergy medicine. I asked that to clarify too. Yeah. Okay. So hopefully that was helpful and interesting. I just wanted to do that to show kind of the process of interpreting a dream, and then also just how much you can kind of get out of just like a little 4-line thing like she offered. And hopefully, like I think one of the big connections that we made is the connection between the magenta Keurig coffee machine to the pre-cal teacher and the magenta calculator for that class. I think that's probably the biggest one that we made. I could have probably gone on further if I had more experience with this to try to connect more things together. But that's the whole process of dream interpretation. You're trying to connect things together that seem unrelated but have some kind of significance to the person. So it really requires a really strong connection with the person to do it. I didn't have this strong connection, but we were still able to get somewhere like pretty far, I think. So hopefully that was helpful. So we're going to go ahead and move on, and we're going to talk about Beyond the Pleasure Principle, and then we're going to try to rush through Lacan. I'll probably go through this part a little bit quicker because I really do want to get to Lacan because he's a lot of fun. So fear versus anxiety versus fright. So fear requires a definite object to be afraid of. That feels pretty self-explanatory. Anxiety is fear without that object, and it's designed to protect against fright, which can be traumatic. And then fright is the state a person is in when you run into danger without being prepared for it. So anxiety is supposed to kind of keep you on guard to make sure that you don't end up being surprised, basically. There's a lot of implications of these definitions, but this is where you start to get the idea of like anxiety dreams. It's like there's something, or you're worried that there's something that could frighten you. So your dream expresses that in the form of like being really anxious about something. So I thought that was interesting. Does anyone have any thoughts on like these definitions? Okay, we're gonna go ahead and move on. So the death drive
Oh
now.
wait, I
Oh,
wasn't unmuted. My bad.
oh, okay. Yeah.
So would Freud sort of see like anxiety as like an irrational fear, like a base like an unbased fear, or is it just like a pre-gaming fear? What is it exactly?
No, he would say anxiety. Well, I don't think he would bring rationality into it at all. He would say it has a very definitive purpose. It's to protect you. It is a protective mechanism. It's a defense. So I don't think he would say it's irrational, but it's just to prevent any kind of trauma from happening, from being frightened, from being surprised when you aren't prepared for something like that. So it puts you in a state of always being prepared.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah. Okay. Anything else? No? Okay. So now the death drive. So this is also part of Beyond the Pleasure Principle. So this is one of his later works, and this is where he decides to be a bit more speculative. So let's see. This is arguably a more philosophical work, but he's still trying to explain these phenomena as rigorous as possible. It's just that he thinks it's not. It's arguable if science can actually back this up from the somatic side of the psychosomatic. So the question that he really starts off with is, why do we have repeated traumatic experiences, like with PTSD? And I think that is also really telling that he published this work in 1920, 2 years after World War I, which a lot of people came back with PTSD. So there's a lot of patients that he could have worked with that had this experience, that was kind of raising this for the first time to him. Then another thing that he said is supposed to be traumatic for a child is repeating the disappearance of their mother in the form of a game. Or also in self-harming behavior. There's all sorts of different ways that we repeat certain kinds of trauma almost. And the question is like, why do we do this? And he says that basically there's a kind of repetition compulsion that we have, which he identifies as a drive to conserve or return to a previous state. And then this is what he calls the death drive. It's this kind of conservative repetition compulsion that's trying to get us back to the original inorganic state. So we can think about, we can also start to use the term eros for the pleasure principle, because that's what he starts to use, and that's what later secondary sources start to use. So we have eros, which can be thought of as trying to increase tension in the form of pleasure. Then we have the death drive, or thanatos, as people also refer to it as trying to reduce that tension. So one's kind of trying to go upwards, the other's trying to go down, and they're in a constant like state of back and forth here. And ultimately, the death drive wins because it brings us to death, the inorganic state. But there's this tension here. And he also says then that there's this principle called the nirvana principle, which basically tries to bring us back all the way to that like inorganic state where there is no tension. That's the idea of it. It's kind of the goal of the death drive. It's to bring us back to that kind of original nothingness there. So, and it's in opposition to eros. So the death drive is thought to be the source of destructive and aggressive behavior. And then the superego is actually the representation of the death drive in the psyche. Because remember, the thing that creates it is repression from being threatened with violence, castration. And then the id would be representative of eros, and the ego mediates between them. So this is called the drive theory, the drives theory, where he's evolved just to two drives instead of the one, which is the pleasure principle. Any questions about the death drive?
Yeah.
uh,
Oh, sorry. I was just curious because so the only work I've really read in its entirety from Freud is Civilization, and I didn't, from what I last read, pick up on any like major overtones of this. But are there any like neo-Freudians that write about the thanatos and the libido as like a dialectical process that affects the human being, or at least in terms of the concept as a dialectical process that affects the human being?
I think it would depend on what you're classifying as a dialectic, because definitely not in like a Hegelian sense. But I know that you also have like different hermeneutical views on the dialectic. So if you could clarify that a little bit, then
Materialist dialectic.
yeah.
So like I'm trying to think, because I'd argue that it's from perception that we find the dialectic, and I'm trying to think if there's anybody maybe outside of like Sartre who is arguing against it that puts it into good enough words. But even then, his concept is kind of escaping me right now. Can't see if I think of a better way to describe it, and then come back with this question later.
Okay, that sounds good. And then Greg, you had a question, right?
Yeah. I don't know. The death drive actually sounds pretty life denying.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, is there any other like overtones or overlap, or I don't know, like what's up there?
Yeah.
I
So
don't exactly know.
connections like with
Yeah.
Nietzsche, basically.
Yeah.
Yeah, okay. So there's actually a little bit of debate with the connections between Freud and Nietzsche. So I think that Nietzsche deserves like the spot of being like the first psychologist, especially with like his work in like the genealogy of morals and just like with all of his like moral criticisms. I think he definitively lays a lot of the groundwork and provides a lot of the kinds of thought that Freud later elaborates on or formulates his own way. And then, so like one of the reasons I said my favorite defense mechanism is reaction formation is because it seems very similar to ressentiment. So I think there are a lot of connections, and then also this is actually kind of funny. So Freud at one point said to like his close friends that he doesn't want to discuss Nietzsche because he wants to make sure that like it doesn't look like he's stealing from Nietzsche's ideas, which he learned about Nietzsche after he started his writing. So like there is some originality to it, but he did recognize the connection there, and this actually led to a funny situation where one of his close friends gifted him a collection of all of Nietzsche's works. Because Freud had been denying that he had read Nietzsche, even though he had the works. So by the friend giving him all of his books, it was kind of a way for Freud to say, oh, now I can say that I've read Nietzsche and I can talk about him publicly. It gives him that excuse where he's not being contradictory with himself anymore. But yeah, no, there are a lot of connections. I have a bunch of JSTOR articles that are just about like connections between Nietzsche and Freud. There's a lot of literature on this. I highly recommend taking a look at it because I too recognize that there's a very strong a really strong connection there. So. Anything else?
Yeah, I mean,
Oh yeah, no, go for it.
Basically, oh no, I'm just gonna imply that it's basically like a mirror. Um, of course, with different like objectives and different analysis, but it's very also in as much as the pleasure principle like gives form to like uh the mind generally, it also seems very Apollonian. But I mean, I don't know. Anyway, but then it would be the Dionysian. So I'm a little confused, but I believe it's going very.
All right. Yeah.
Anyway.
Okay. I saw Daniel unmuted there just for a moment. Do you have a formulation of what you were trying to say earlier?
Yeah. So, to kind of distinguish the term I was using from the Hegelian dialectic, which involves the use of Geist to sort of manifest change, the idea of a material dialectic is less of this like objective force that is placed upon the universe that is the actual one momentum of things, but rather the way of understanding things as event. And understanding things as they do in what their purpose is. Kind of like what I've been trying to, or not what I've been trying to, what I did try to get at earlier with the single comment about Freud's whole fear of castration thing. How the child can't actually fear castration, but the idea is supposed to affect the person in some way to come to this understanding of, okay, well, the child has this intense fear, And the idea of a dialectic. And although I've been told that word, is not maybe the best choice because it's a very Hegelian word. I still like it just because of how common it is mainly a perception thing of you can still, in terms of most concepts, come to understand them from the process of thesis, antithesis, synthesis, and as an event, as a, let's just say, set up conflict resolution structure. That generally is a good way to come to understand things. And so I was wondering if specifically from the human perspective, and I base this on a little bit. I still have to do a lot more reading into this, of course. This is a new topic in my life overall, only having been a few years into it. With Nietzsche, of course, Birth of Tragedy, and the ideas of art, and a lot of what I do in theater is where I find a lot of these ideas as well. And Heidegger, and I don't want to keep going on this for too long, but it comes in Heidegger's idea of uncanniness, and to quote Alan Watts, we are the universe experiencing itself. But yeah, I was wondering if Freud's idea of the libido and the thanatos could be that idea of, the human being opposed to itself in some way, shape or form, and then the result is, the events of the life of the human being, and if it could be understood in that sort of dialectical way.
Yeah, I think you can understand it that way. I would say yes. I don't. So the main like kind of post-Freudian, still Freudian thinkers that I know, I don't know how big of an emphasis they place on that. The main one I'm thinking of is Marcuse, um, but I think that you can see it in that lens. Yeah.
Okay, cool. I was just curious because, again, yeah,
Yeah.
very interested in that idea.
All right. Yeah. Okay. So if there's no other questions, comments, then we can start to move on to Lacan. So is there anything else?
One quick thing.
Yeah.
So I have like a couple of theories as to why people might want to relive their experiences. I'm not really sure like which one of them like Freud would agree with most, but I don't know if you've noticed this thing about like small children is that they tend to watch the same show or the same movie over and over and over again.
Mm-hmm.
I think a lot of that has to do with like, or go ahead.
Oh, I was just gonna say, remember, the question isn't why do we repeat things, it's why do we repeat traumatic experiences.
I guess my answer to that would be like sort of correction or a desire to correct the uncorrectable.
What do
Like
you
there's a
mean by that?
situation you feel like you could have there's a situation you felt like you could have handled it differently, which you might perceive to that may have resulted in a fundamentally different outcome. So you try to relive it in a way that will
Well,
it basically allows you to fantasize about correcting what went wrong.
I feel like that doesn't really touch on like some of the examples that he gives, like with PTSD, for example. Like I don't think that really maps on with what you're saying. Also, like with the child repeating the disappearance of their mother, there isn't any kind of like attempt at controlling the situation there. It is very much the fact of the traumatic experience itself is the thing that's being repeated. It's not like a kind of reliving, I don't think.
Would Freud
Yeah,
would Freud
it's a little
say?
more complicated.
Wait, go ahead.
No, I was just saying it seems a little bit more complicated than what I was thinking.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
Freud say we traumatic.
Oh, you're cutting out a little bit.
Oh, sorry. Would Freud say we traumatic because we relive them?
Say that one more time. You cut out like you said. Would Freud say, and then you cut out, and then it cut in at random points again. Oh,
You may want to turn off the auto
the
detect
auto
on the voice thing.
yeah,
Auto determine input sensitivity. Just set that to a manual setting, and then that should
I think he's
help out
typing
with
it
that.
now, though.
All right.
This GIF that you sent is just repeating on my screen over and over. I've been staring at this whole time.
It's one of those that you just like can't take your eyes off of, you know?
Yeah.
It's very simple, but it's got a lot going on.
Okay, so would Freud say we repeat traumatic experiences because we relive them? So like an example, like with the example of PTSD, I mean, I'm not quite sure what you mean. Like, what would the distinction there between repeating and reliving? Because it feels like it's just one motion. Like the repeating is the reliving is the repeating. Relive is in thinking about. Oh, okay. He's not so much concerned with the actual like thinking about it, like a fantasizing about it, because remember he's mostly focused on the unconscious, and he would say that like in a lot of these cases, the PTSD, like for example, that's like totally involuntary. You know, it's like no one voluntarily goes through like PTSD flashbacks. It's always triggered by something. So I think he's more interested in why it is that that takes place. And I feel like with the example of like children repeating the disappearance of their mother, I feel like he would say that they don't yet have this like the kind of development that we would need to be able to like fantasize about like trying to fix that problem. I feel like that would require a bit more of a complex kind of psyche to be able to think about it and consciously relive it like through thought rather than like through kind of action. So okay. Any last comments or questions before we move on to Lacan? And I'm going to try to get through Lacan a bit quickly because we have technically 7 minutes, but also there's technically an unofficial meeting, so we can go on for forever. I see someone is typing. I'll wait for that. Um, it's more that he's asking why is it that there's something that's being triggered. I think he is interested in the specific triggers like that. He would go into like an interpretive process. I don't think it would be terribly deep. You know, like I mean, I don't think you have to do a lot of work to figure out why it is that fireworks trigger like a soldier's PTSD. You know, like that feels pretty direct. But I also do think that like there's something behind the fact that he talked about fear, anxiety, and fright in this same work. Because like in a lot of ways, the kind of trauma that he's talking about in the case of PTSD is caused by fright. So I think he would make a lot of connections there, and he would say that that's the kind of thing that would be triggering it, if that makes sense. Okay, yeah, cool. Okay, now for Lacan. So first, do Lacan and Elton John look alike?
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah,
Okay.
a little bit.
I think Elton John looks more like Matthew Brown.
Our professor?
Yes.
I can kind of see that, I think. Yeah, I mean, yeah, with different hair maybe. Okay. Um, okay, so first, Lacan has like his own jargon. I wanted to go through some of it a little bit. And this is not all of this, especially towards the bottom of the list, is going to make perfect sense yet. One thing that you really need to work on with Lacan is that with a lot of thinkers, like you can get a certain amount of confidence from just learning about some of their ideas because you can almost develop a certain kind of like naive, simple understanding of what they are, and you can kind of start to apply that to things. Lacan, though, is like a real dick about it because he is so difficult in his writing that you are always a bit insecure about your own knowledge with him because you always feel like you don't know what the landscape is. Like with that kind of like naive understanding of like what somewhat like a naive simple understanding of like let's say Marx, you can kind of like start to figure out where things are in relationship to each other. With Lacan, he like totally subverts you at every single turn. So it's going to be really difficult to like get into the language of it, but when you start to get with the rhythm of what's going on, it starts to make a lot more sense. So first, he really tries to connect Saussure's linguistics, which he talks about connections basically between signifiers as like words or concepts, and signified, which is the thing that the signifier refers to. So you would say that the signifier is that which represents signified. The signified is what's represented by the signifier, and it's like the quote-unquote real thing that's being represented. Then there's the master signifier, which is a specific kind of signifier that only refers to itself, and it doesn't have any meaning except through its symbolic connections. So like someone like Zizek would say, the idea of freedom, the signifier of freedom, is a master signifier because its meaning is totally dependent on other signifiers. For example, like if you have another signifier connected to it that's liberalism, that totally changes your idea of what freedom is. If you have one that is communism, that totally changes the idea of freedom, also changes things like justice, all of these kind of ideas. They're all master signifiers that are, what he would say, ideologically constructed. Then there's language. Language is, of course, really important, and it's basically the set of symbolic connections between signifiers. He also uses basically the term symbolic order in a broader way. Language is like a part of a symbolic order, or is within the scope of a symbolic order, but they're structurally they are the same. It's just that the symbolic order has a lot more implications beyond just mere language. Then there is the little other, which is denoted by the lowercase o starting it, which is the other that is a reflection or projection of the ego, and it relates to us via identification, which is imaginary, which we're going to talk about in a moment. And then there's the big other, which is denoted by the capital O, which you might have heard if you know anything about Zizek. He talks about the big other a lot. And it's that other that is totally othered from us, and it cannot be related to us via identification. It's symbolic, which has a greater sense of alterity to it, or otherness. So now onto these like three registers here, the imaginary, symbolic, and the real. So the imaginary deals with images, specifically in the realm of the ego. And interestingly, Lacan also says that animals work only within the realm of the imaginary, but that our imaginaries, the human imaginary, is also in part structured by the symbolic. So our imaginary deviates from nature. But he does identify the imaginary very strongly with nature. Then there's the symbolic. This is a lot more complicated. So first, the imaginary, the images that we're talking about are just kind of like mental images of things. So like I can like look at certain objects and like I denote them as like discrete objects. I have a candle on my desk here. The fact that I can recognize the candle with like the lid on the candle as two different discrete objects show that I have different kind of images for them. Likewise, there are a lot of symbolic connections that go with those, that give those things meaning, give them certain properties, things like that. And that's why the imaginary and the symbolic are really closely tied together, and that's why I have them connected here with reality. I'll sometimes refer to them collectively as reality. But the symbolic is made up of connections through metaphor and metonymy, and it also is what structures language. The symbolic is the order of radical alterity. It's totally other to us. Our language is always other to us. It was made by others. You are merely born into it. You learn it from others. Language is always the language of the other. So we're always kind of alienated from the language that we're using. We can never totally identify with it. It's never ours. It's always someone else's. And then the symbolic is also the place in which the unconscious is. So we can say our symbolic order is basically the unconscious. The connections that we make between things, that's what the unconscious is structured through. That interestingly makes our unconscious other to us. And then the symbolic also regulates our desires, and because it's representative of the law, it's also the realm of culture. So like in Freud, civilization was the product of us repressing our aggressive death instincts and our unacceptable desires with the like law of the father from the Oedipal complex. Likewise, because the symbolic is representative of the law, it is also the realm in which culture and civilization comes from. And then the third one, the real, is really hard to explain because to define it would be to bring it into the symbolic and imaginary registers. And the whole point of it is that it totally resists reality. You can think of like having a certain kind of traumatic encounter that like jostles you, makes you totally reconsider your perspective on life, changes your perspective entirely. That would be like an encounter with the real. The real can be incredibly traumatic to encounter. It can also be a source of ecstasy, though. But the purpose of the symbolic and imaginary is in some ways to keep us at a distance from the real. It's not just that which resists reality, but that which unravels and undoes it. If the symbolic is the realm of alterity, then the real is so far from the other that it can't even be recognized as the other. We aren't just distant from the real, but we're also intimately connected with it. The real provides a fundamental lack that causes our desire. We have this irreducible kernel of the real at our core that the symbolic order is based upon, and from which our desire comes. The real isn't a positive thing either. It's more like a pure lacking, a site of negativity. Lacan says that the only things within the symbolic and imaginary exist, but the real exists, or exist, which is borrowed from Heidegger. Lacan translated Heidegger early on in his career, so he has a lot of influence from that. And existence for Heidegger is tied to the possibility of the future, which isn't existing yet, it exists. So the real is always beyond like our current structural position of existence. It isn't. I was about to say it's not real. It is real, but it's not like a thing out there. There's no like real object that you can actually encounter and that gives you like a traumatic experience. It's way more complicated than that. Okay, so questions. I imagine there's probably some at least about the real.
So by exist, is that like formally exists? Is that how you can interpret that?
Do you say formally exist?
Yeah.
No,
When
it
you
does.
said exists.
No, it's more like the possibility to exist, but in that possibility, it's affirming that it does not yet exist. That's at least that's the Heideggerian term, the Heideggerian usage of it. For Lacan, it's more designating that it is beyond reality. It's not something that exists within reality.
Okay.
Yeah.
So it kind of is it like hypothetical in a way?
It's not hypothetical. It's so I'll be honest, this is part of the like I'm not very good at the Heideggerian term here. But it's I think the best way to think about it is just a pure site of negativity. It's not an actual object, it's a lacking within objects.
We maybe call it
Got it.
a site of pure potentiality.
Yeah, kind of. And out of that kind of potentiality, that's where desire comes from. Because for Lacan, like desire is fundamentally structured by a lack. So like you are trying to you're trying to fill in something, almost fill in the lack. That's what causes you to like go out and desire things. Yeah. Okay. Any other questions? Yeah, actually, Daniel just said something really helpful in the chat. It's like nothingness as a space for manifestation of will or sight for dwelling, which is like the Heideggerian usage of it. But I think that's really helpful. It's a possibility of a place that you can manifest like your will into almost. Yeah, that's really helpful. Thank you for that. Any other questions? No? Okay, awesome. Okay, now, so we're going to go on to something called the mirror stage, which is really important in Lacan's like account of subject formation. We're also this is going to talk a lot more about the imaginary register in particular. So the child encounters themselves in the mirror, which usually takes place around 6 to 18 months. It's not that they encounter themselves at that point, but it's that they're able to recognize themselves in a mirror. And it's not just like their own ability to recognize themselves, but it's also that they have like their parent or guardian like pointing at them in the mirror saying, that's you. There's a social kind of formation to it as well. And before this happens, before the identification of yourself in the mirror, you are kind of just like a bundle of like drives and needs. There's no, you don't actually, he would say you don't have desire before this. You just have needs that can only be fulfilled through like the same kind of expression. So the infant only can express themselves via crying for any kind of need they have. So once they start to encounter language, then you can start to see these needs start to be structured in terms of desire. But you're just dealing with this kind of loose bundle that isn't quite united yet. Then once you start to identify with yourself in the mirror, you have kind of more of a definitive idea of yourself, and you're able to find some kind of unity. And then it's also really important to recognize that the image that the child encounters isn't an image of them, because it's always still other to them. It's they're identifying themselves with an other that looks like them. It's a representation of the big other. And it's important to note that the big other is not just others, like lowercase others. Like the big other is not ever manifested as a person. There's a certain kind of like otherness to it. It's like a structural position within language that causes there to be this need for a big other. So then the second step is they identify with their image, which forms the ideal ego. And what happens is the mirror image basically becomes what's called the specular image, which also becomes the ideal ego. And that's when it becomes the image becomes integrated into the imaginary register. It becomes a defined, discrete psychical object for the child that they can interact with in their mind. It integrates it into their psyche. And then the third is that the image forms the ego, which is the ego ideal. Which these terms are confusing, but they're from Freud, because Lacan started by basically being like a really banal like Freud interpreter. So he basically, Freud used these interchangeably. Lacan saying no, there's like very clear distinctions here. But the effective signification that comes from the other is what turns the ideal ego into the ego ideal, not eagle. And that basically integrates this image of the child that they have of themselves into the symbolic order itself. And we'll see this later on in the graphs of desire. There's a section at the bottom that demonstrates as well. But this process builds alienation directly into the subject, because the specular image that they first form is missing something fundamental that the infant has or doesn't have. It's the central lack that causes desire. There's always some kind of inequality between themselves and the thing they're trying to identify themselves with. Because desire is what makes us like alive. Like we only stop desiring when we're dead. But we're identifying ourselves and basing our egos off of the image of the other that has no desire to correspond to. There's always a disjunction. There's always some kind of alienation there. And this is in part where the death drive comes in, because you're identifying with like basically a dead static image. But you aren't that. You're the opposite. You're alive. You have desire. You can like do things. But you're saying like that's me. So there's this almost a desire to kind of identify there, and that can be manifested as a desire to get rid of desire. And then this builds the imaginary order, this is how the imaginary is centered around the ego, because it comes out in this ego formation. Any questions about the mirror stage?
Yeah, I'll go ahead because this kind of gets back at what I was talking about a little bit with the Thanatos libido kind of dialectic idea that I had going on. Because the ideal ego and the ego ideal, what you described first of how they interact, seems very much like that kind of dialectical processing I was trying to get at earlier. Of course, I was not trying to get at this Lacanian idea. I've never touched Lacan a day in my life.
Shame.
But yeah, I know I need to read Lacan. And you working on that thesis about Lacan and constantly kind of talking about him and posting about him has me very close to ordering a couple of his more seminal works.
Do it. Give in.
I need to. Yeah, the way what is the if I'm thinking about this right, the ideal ego and the ego ideal, one causes another in the first like event in a human life that causes these concepts as we could possibly interpret them to be within a human life, is something forms. So like their image forms the ideal ego, which when taken away gets opposed by the now ego ideal, which is now the potential of that image in their brain, and then that in turn forms a new kind of reasoning based on that?
Sort of. So the ideal ego is also internalized. It's just internalized into the imaginary register.
Yeah.
What the difference is between the ideal ego and the ego ideal is basically, I'll explain this a little bit more when we get to the graph of desire, but the signifier and language comes in, and it's usually the language of the other. And basically, the signifier signifies or like integrates the ideal ego into the symbolic order, which that's what the ego ideal is. It's the ideal ego that has been brought into the symbolic order.
Okay. Yep. Then yes, this is very much a dialectical process.
Yeah,
Cool.
no. I know this isn't the same kind of dialectic you're talking about, but Lacan was heavily influenced by Hegel, and you can see this especially in the graph of desire. So he does think a lot about dialectics, but also in like a really messy way that doesn't. It's not true to like Hegel's dialectic at all. You know, his is a lot cleaner.
Mhm. I will say Hegel isn't necessarily wrong about a lot of things. I like a lot of his descriptions of the process. I just don't agree that, because his entire idea is undercut by the concept of Geist, which he kind of inserts to be the Christian God. And that's where I kind of divorce myself from Hegel a little bit. But Hegel's dialectic is pretty faithful to what I would consider to be some of the original conceptions.
Okay. Awesome. Are there any other questions before we move on? Okay, seems like no. So we're going to talk about Lacan's Oedipus complex. It's a little different. I mentioned before, it's not as biologically based as Freud. The mother and father are the symbolic roles. You're probably wondering why I wrote mother like that. This is a popular English way to write mother because there's, of course, the connection between mother and other in English. So it's emphasizing the fact that the mother is playing this first primary role of the other. So first, Lacan would say once the child is born, they have a special relationship to the primary caregiver, which he designates the name of mother. So like the biological like father can be the role of the mother, and he would just call them the mother in that case because they're fulfilling the role. And basically what happens is that there's a certain kind of unity between the two because for the child has all these different needs, and the mother can totally fulfill them for the child. There's nothing that the child needs that the mother is unable to fulfill. Now, the difficulty comes in is that this is kind of an incomplete unity. It's a one-sided thing because the mother also has needs, some of which the child can fulfill. But there's a lot of needs that the mother needs to turn to someone else to, which would be the father. We can think in some ways of like sexual needs, but there's also like a lot of other kind of emotional needs that the child can't necessarily provide, that the father can. So this is where the difficulty starts to come in because then the father has to step in and it interrupts the mother-child unity. So in this initial unity, there's this thing that we call jouissance. This is a certain kind of pleasure. It's the French term. It's incredibly difficult to translate. And there's a long like page on nosubject.com, which is like a Lacan wiki, just talking about jouissance. And it's something like extreme pleasure, but it's pleasure that has a deadly reference. It's almost like pleasure to the point of disgust at the intolerable level of pleasure you're feeling. It's overwhelming, basically. And it breaks from the Freudian kind of understanding of the pleasure principle because the pleasure principle obeys the law of seeking to reduce tension through the experience of pleasure discharging itself. So like the pleasure principle has desires which increases tension, and then through fulfilling those desires, those tensions decrease again. But jouissance doesn't do that. It just goes beyond like the pleasure principle in that kind of Freudian sense. And it has this, that's why it has this kind of deadly referent. It does deal with death and like the things that are disturbing in that kind of way. Now then that's the initial pre-Oedipal jouissance. There is also, after what's called symbolic castration, which happens in the Oedipus complex, jouissance begins to provide the illusion that if you were to transgress the law of the father that comes about from symbolic castration, then you would experience pleasure. But what would actually happen is you would experience a lot of pain by going beyond the law of the father. So the symbolic jouissance has that kind of illusory quality there. Okay, so I went through the second point. Yeah, so it's less explicitly sexual, like I said. It's just about kind of filling needs. So then the symbolic castration. This is actually interesting because Freud, in his Oedipus complex, it isn't that the child actually gets castrated. It's that the threat of it is what allows for them to kind of survive the Oedipus complex and for them to form their psyche. For Lacan, they are castrated in this process, but it's something called symbolic castration. And basically, within this kind of this conflict, you're not only dealing with just like the individuals at play, but the fact that you're also dealing with the other in mother as language. You're kind of grappling with language here, and basically you're trying to see like who's gonna win. You are actually like at war with language, because language is trying to impose all of its concepts, all of its symbolic relations onto you, so that way you can like engage with other people. And symbolic castration occurs most of the time, which is when you lose against language and language wins. Now, the interesting thing is when you win, that's what Lacan calls psychosis, because the important thing about symbolic castration is it grounds you into the symbolic order through the master signifier. And the master signifier is what he calls the phallus, or also the name of the father. And basically, when you have psychosis, you don't have you're not grounded in the symbolic order. You still have one, but like it's kind of distant. You're not connected to it. It doesn't really affect you. Okay, any questions about this? Because we're going to go to the graph of desire next. No? Okay. Awesome. So, and thanks for everyone for sticking around. I know that we're a bit over, but hopefully you guys are enjoying this. So I find this stuff really interesting, at least. So, okay. Now this is where it actually starts to get extremely complicated. So if you can see my camera, some of you might have seen this hoodie that I'm wearing. It has the completed graph of desire on it. I usually wear it to philosophy club. So, it's a good hoodie, but this is actually going to be going through and explaining this. So there's 4 different stages to the graph of desire. This is the elementary cell. This is the very first one. And you can see here that, can you see my mouse when I'm streaming on Discord? Just question.
Yes.
Okay, sweet. So this delta down here at the bottom right with this arrow starting, this is basically the desire for knowledge. From S to S prime, this is the signifying chain, or the connection between 2 signifiers. We can see S and S prime as just 2 signifiers. And we see that this desire for knowledge actually goes beyond the signifying chain, so beyond what can be signified, and then it comes back down to this barred S, which is just the split subject here. The subject that's split by language, by symbolic castration. The really important thing to note here, there's not a whole lot going on yet, but the important thing is that the arrow, the direction of the arrow from delta to the split subject is going backwards to the signifying chain. This is the effect of retroversion, I believe it's called. And this is like what Lacan would say, the reason why, wait, fuck, I'm trying to get my mouse. Okay. It is the, oh, you guys can't see the camera? Oh, okay. Well, I guess I can turn off my camera then. I've had it on this whole time, but it's not that important. I can send a picture of it later, but you guys will see the completed graph here anyway. But the effect of retroversion is the idea of like, if I say the sentence, or I start the sentence, the weed is, there's a couple different ways that I could like end that. And it doesn't get any kind of meaning until I give it an ending. So the end of the sentence gives the whole thing a meaning, the beginning of it. So if I say the weed is getting me high, that is a very different meaning than the weed is getting too high, you know? Or the weeds are getting too high, you know? The fact that the end of the sentence, the punctuation, he would say, changes the meaning of it. Likewise, you can say like a normal kind of sentence has a very different meaning if it has a period versus if it has an exclamation mark, you know? That can mean anger, excitement, anything, just much more extreme. So this is the first stage. Now we're going to move on to the next stage here. This gets a lot more complicated, and there's still 2 more after this. But let me just make sure. Okay, yeah, I'll just make sure there's no more messages. Okay, so I have to move my second monitor real quick. Okay. So now we see that the place of the signifier, not the signifier, the split subject is actually switched. We see capital I, capital O here, where the split subject used to be, but now we've switched over to the other side. And this is basically just because the subject becomes like the locus for desire once it encounters the signifying chain. The signifying chain allows it to basically express its own desires, including that desire for knowledge. So we see here that the split subject basically goes up to lowercase I, lowercase o. And what the O's are here in the entire graph is other. That's what it represents. With some of them, it might say A instead, which is this. It means the same thing. It's just the French term for it, autre. So it's originally A, but sometimes it's translated to O for English. And then the lowercase I here, this is the imaginary ego here, or the ideal ego. Sorry. This whole little circuit here, this bottom part, is the mirror stage. So we go up. Our desire for knowledge basically brings us up to the ideal ego, which then kind of moves over here through the kind of effective retroversion, and then basically the signification of the other comes down and affects it at E, which brings us to brings the imaginary not imaginary ego, the ideal ego, into the symbolic order in the form of the ego ideal. So this is just the mirror stage over and over, like we talked about. Now the upper part, it starts to get more complicated. So this just single O here, this is the big other. This is the famous big other that Zizek talks about. And basically, it has this authority over its own signification, over language itself through the act of retroversion. And we can think about like the other as being really tied with language here. Because like I said earlier, language is always other to me. It's always made by others. It's always taught to me by others. People like teach me individual words that I then use to express my own concepts. It's like it's never mine. I never own it. So in this sense, language is other, but also in the very practice of speaking, there's an other element to it. So like, does anyone talk to themselves?
All the time.
Okay.
Yep.
Who are
I know
you
what you're
talking
asking,
to?
but yeah.
Of course.
Who
Myself, obviously.
But why are you saying it out loud? Why not just think it?
That's a good point.
Well, I don't know you guys are real, so I have to say it out loud so I know that I'm talking to something, right?
True. But
The act of speaking kind of forces you to formulate your thoughts in a more coherent way.
yeah, so Lacan would say that though, what you are doing by speaking, like to yourself, is you are actually speaking to the big other. And that in that act of speaking that like helps you formulate your thoughts, you are getting the big other's recognition of those thoughts. That's one of the reasons why speaking like to yourself can actually be really helpful, because you're almost getting someone else's input, because you're forcing yourself to articulate yourself to the big other in the way that it understands. Because before, like if you're thinking, like you don't necessarily have to think about all the individual words all the time, So then we still have the same thing. The signifier goes to the other signifier, which here is called voice, which is basically just like the enunciation. That's all that is. And then we still have the effective retroversion here going up. Any questions about either of the 2 stages so far? I see some people typing. Oh, that's just Boxy with an emote. Okay, cool. Wait, she's not even in the voice chat. Okay, we can ignore that. Okay, so no questions. This makes perfect sense. All clear, or enough sense. Okay.
Enough.
Enough. Perfect. Sometimes that's what we're gonna have to deal with Lacan. So okay. So now we're gonna move on to the next part of the graph. Oh, I heard Discord message. Oh, okay. Yeah, still boxy. Okay. So now we see this big extension here, in the form of the question, cheveux, I think, or chevoy, I think. It's Italian, not French. I still want to do the French pronunciation. And it's the question means, what do you want?
Okay, boy.
Chevoy. That's it. Thank you. So it means, what do you want? And basically, this is the subject asking the other, like, well, what do you want? Like, it's asking about its own desire. Because one of the things I didn't go through like very well, or I might have done it very quickly, is that our desire is always modeled after the other's desire. So we learn how to desire by encountering others through language, and language is what forms our desire. Language is also the other, like it's part of the other. So the other structures our own desires. So we're trying to figure out, like, what is it that the other desires, because the other gives us our desire. We model our desire off of the other. So it's presupposing that there's a desire there to be modeled off of, is what I'm saying. And that is what this term, wait, let me go mouse. That's what this term, little lowercase d, is. That is the desire that we are trying to articulate in the question, kevoy. And then this is kind of going up. It also, importantly, this is intentionally shaped to kind of look like a question mark. Lacan likes to do a lot of little cheap things like that in his graphs. And then that brings us over here to the barred subject encountering the little other, the lowercase o, which is also the objet petit a, or the objet a. And what this is basically the object cause of desire. So like when I talked about the thing that, like, the ideal ego is missing, or the specular image is missing in the mirror stage, is desire. What Lacan would say is that fundamentally is the little other here, the objet a. And this is the thing, the object cause of desire. It's what causes our desire, what produces our desire. We can even find it in others. Like if I find someone, like, really, like, attractive or desirable, it would be that thing about them that I find desirable, but I can't quite articulate what it is, you know? It's like Zizek has this like little saying of, like, if you can say what you, like, love about someone, you don't actually love them. It's like it has to be this kind of inarticulatable real thing to actually, like, provoke your desire. So, and that is what causes fantasy. And what happens is when the split subject, the castrated subject, encounters the objet a, the object caused of desire, it can also be, like, the object of their desire when it's represented, like, in the form of someone else or something else. Fantasy basically comes out, because what happens is the objet a is this purely negative thing because it's real. So when you encounter it as, like, an object, as objectified, they're basically, it's like he has an interesting way of saying it, which is like when you encounter, like, this pure lacking, he says, like, being seems to be a mistake. And in order to rectify that, you need this positive outflowing of fantasy from that lacking, from that mistake of being, to make it seem justified. And that's where fantasy comes from. This is also, I will dip my toes into Zizek a little bit. This is why he focuses so much on sublime objects when he's talking about ideology, because the sublime object for him has a lot of connections with the objet a. He develops it a little bit more, so it has a lot more, like, Kantian and Hegelian baggage with it, but it's still the objet a. And what he says is that what ideology is, that structures our literal experience of the world, is basically that fantasy that comes from us encountering those sublime objects. Okay. And then, let's see, I think I got through everything here. So is there any questions about this part? Okay, is this all making sense, or is it just, like, really confusing? It's hard to tell when you get into, like, the really, like, deep details of some of this.
personally, I'm not like, I have a hard time visualizing things. So I understand the concepts of what's going on here. I just find this graph like completely unnecessary.
Yeah, no, I understand that. Yeah. Lacan does like to do a lot with like topography and graphs and things like that. It's like, oh man, in one of the secondary sources I read, it said that he likes to describe a certain concept through basically the topography of this impossible shape. It's supposed to be like this circle that turns inside out in the middle of it. It's like it's impossible to visualize in three-dimensional space at least. But it's just like he loves all of these like really weird things. But yeah. Ahad, do you have something to say?
Yeah, do you mind like really quickly running it, like kind of summing up the other two graphs? Because I feel like I'm missing something from before. Everything kind of like depends on you know what I'm saying?
Yeah, okay. So do you have anything in specific about it? Because that is a lot. It's a lot to do. You know, I can do it, but I just want to make sure that like I don't miss on anything in particular.
Well, I mean, this is the point at the like if this was a lecture, this is the point of the lecture. I would just like look at the slides while while listening to the lecture and kind of go back.
Okay.
Hmm.
So, but there's no individual like
Yeah.
concept that's giving you trouble. It's just kind of the whole thing.
Yeah, because I feel like I missed something from before, and it's like cascade. Like if there's like, because I noticed the key of the graph, like what all the symbols mean, it changes to only reflect the differences. You know what I'm saying? So if you like don't remember what one of the symbols means, you can't
Yeah.
really do that unless you go back through the slides.
Yeah, no, I can run through the symbols real quick if that's what you want. So
Oh yeah, that would help. Yeah.
yeah, okay, so the bottom right, if you can see my mouse there, that is the split subject, which is the subject that is split through the Oedipus complex that comes from the symbolic castration. Then you go up to the lowercase I, lowercase o here. This is the ideal ego. Then we go over to here. The E, I believe, is ego. It forms the ego through the specular image. And then through basically the symbolic connection here to the other and this in the signification of the other, it transforms the ego down into the ego ideal, which is the same thing as the specular image, except into the symbolic order. It has signifiers now. It has connections between signifiers. It has some kind of relational meaning between them. So then also in this process, we have to deal with the effects of language. And language, like I said earlier, is always the language of the other. And I used the example, I remember, of the like talking to yourself. Like there's a reason why articulating has a really important part with language and the concepts that we're using, because it's like we are talking to someone. There's a certain kind of structural position within language that is like making us feel the need to articulate it. And that's what we would call the big other. It has its own signification, which is lowercase s with a capital O. That's the signification of the other. And then from here, what happens is because we model our own desire based on the other's desire, we basically kind of copy it, take it our own, because the language, which is language of the other, forms the structure of our desire. Like I said earlier with the infant, before they learn language, they just have needs. They don't have desire. They can't articulate what they need, and then they can't organize themselves in a way to actually like pursue that. So only once we get language of the other are we able to actually do that. So then this presupposes that there's a certain kind of desire that the other has, which leads us to the question, kevu? No, how did you say it again? Okay. It was like chevu or something.
Say Chevois, probably.
Well, no, it's Italian. That's the reason, because like I know that it's pronounced differently, but I want to do it in the French way, and it's like it's not right. But that means basically, what do you want? And it's the question that we're asking the other by like trying to interrogate its own desire. And desire is a fundamental lack, which is leading us to basically fantasy, because we're encountering the lack of the other. So that's kind of where we are caught up. Did that help?
Yeah, that helped a lot. Yeah.
Okay, awesome.
Can you say again what the S of O is?
That's the signification of the big other. So
Okay, wait, I thought the big O was the.
that is the big other. SO is the signification of it.
What do you
So
mean by signification?
so remember the distinction between the signifier and the signified? The SO is the signifier of O.
Is signifier like? I just don't. What's the definition of signifier? Like,
Okay, so
what does that mean?
do you know the symbolic order that we've been talking about, right?
Yeah.
Okay. So language is probably the best example of this. So language is basically words that refer to something like in the world. So words are signifiers of like things. So like if I say cup, that is referring to like a cup. You know, that the cup is the signified, the word cup is the signifier. Language is a connection and a symbolic connection between all sorts of different signifiers in the form of like words. What this is similarly just a signifier of the big other. It's something that exists within kind of the symbolic order, it has a structural position that refers to the big other.
Right. Okay, that makes sense. So it's like the word that expresses the other or something like that.
Yeah, it's kind of like that.
Okay.
Yeah, and actually, that word would be, I think, the name of the father, which then is what turns the like through the Oedipal conflict turns the ego um, into the ego ideal. It symbolizes it. It brings it into the symbolic order through that castration. So, okay, all good to go on to the next slide. Next one is I think the last one. So we're almost done. Okay. So now for the complete graph. So there's a lot of arrows here. So we're just going to go through the new things real quick. And also the O's did change to A because I've had to find a different image for this. It means the exact same thing as O. It's just the French again. Okay. So now this kind of upper area has been a lot more further developed. So we still have D here, which is desire. Then we kind of go up here to the split subject encountering the demand of the other. Capital D is demand. And this is basically like encountering the father's demand, basically, that you be castrated. You know, that's the encounter there that we're talking about. That has a retroactive effect of this. Now, this capital S and then the barred A is, oh, sorry. It is the signification of the lack of the other, which means, and the lack of the other is the fact that the other doesn't have its own other. So, for example, like when we talked about like talking to yourself, the reason, one of the reasons why you have to do that is because you need an audience to give those words meaning. The other is supposed to be that audience. And the other is also the treasure trove of signifiers. That's where all of them are stored because the language is other. But the other doesn't have its own other. It doesn't have something to give itself the authority to give the signifiers that it has meaning. That's why it's lacking. And in the signification of that lack is where the symbolic jouissance that we talked about earlier comes from. It kind of comes through in the positivized lack of the thing. So like Zizek will talk about how this is a kind of symbolic real where you take this purely negative thing that is the real, you bring it into the symbolic order, and then it can kind of exist and act and interact with things, but it's still purely negative. So he uses the example of like the impossible object that you find in like certain movies. He uses the example of like the MacGuffin, that kind of trope. It's something that just as a structural position to get things going, it doesn't have any kind of meaning itself. And this is actually also the same kind of real kernel that the whole symbolic order is based upon. It's the impossibility for the language, or for the signifiers that the other has to have its meaning that it's based on. So it's based on this impossible kernel, actually. So language is kind of free floating. This is why Zizek says that Lacan isn't a structuralist, because a structuralist would say that there's this kind of underlying structure that's fundamental to everything, that anything can be kind of reduced down to in that respect. So like a structuralist approach to religion would say that like all religions have some kind of fundamental structure that we can reduce it down to, that has some kind of truth to it. Here we're saying that no, because there's this point of radical impossibility and contingency that everything is based upon. So it's based upon almost this kind of like fiction. You can also think about how Nietzsche talks about like the fact that like our ideas of truth originated in lies that we just kind of started to agree on. It's the same kind of idea there. Then the jouissance here, we get fantasy, and then that just brings us back down to the signification of the big other here. So that, I think that is everything about the graph. Any questions?
I mean, well, like I know jouissance is like difficult to define, but what's like the closest approximation?
A kind of overwhelming pleasure that provokes a kind of like disgust at how much pleasure you're feeling.
Okay, so it's like
um in the vernacular, so not necessarily in Lacan's usage, but the verb for um orgasm is jouir, and then jouissance is like a noun formed out of that. So I don't know if
Yeah, no,
if that
that
helps.
definitely has a lot of connections with this, because like the kind of like pleasure that you would get in a sexual encounter like that would be an example of jouissance, you know? Yeah.
And there's actually this biological mechanism where your sort of libido cancels itself out for a few um moments. Like you get this wave of like anti-desire
Yeah, the
after.
post-nut
Yeah.
clarity, is that what you're talking about?
Uh, I don't know what the meme concept is well enough to
Okay,
like,
yeah,
but there's a moment where like um yeah, sexual desire just stops before like resuming. Yeah, but anyway,
no, yeah, I
so
think
there,
that's really
yeah.
helpful to point out, actually, yeah.
I
Because
was
that.
once.
Oh,
Oh,
go
sorry.
ahead. No, go ahead.
Oh, you're done there. I was going to say I've just anecdotal experience. I was once like so overwhelmed with like bodily pleasure that I actually had a seizure.
Oh my gosh.
Uh, so like yeah, no, it's a thing. It happens.
Yeah. Wow.
Well,
And on that note, I think we're gonna head out.
I'll end on a high note. Okay. Yeah. All right. Thanks for coming out. Yeah. And unless anyone has any other questions, we are done. So, yeah.
It was a good meeting.
Yeah.
I
Thanks.
need to go ahead and order Lacan. What
Thank
text
you
for
for
breaching?
doing this online.
So you asked for text recommendations, right?
Yeah, just for breaching into Lacan, because I'm coming in from like I understand because I read a lot of the Heideggerian influence in here.
Yeah.
A lot of what he's doing, ironically, is codifying what Heidegger might call a system of like nothing, capital N. And I like that you kind of pose that psychoanalysis is essenceless, because that transitions very well into Lacan and what seem to be his Heideggerian influences.
Yeah, unfortunately, I don't know a whole lot about the specific like influences that Heidegger had on Lacan, because I try to stay away from Heidegger if at all possible.
Yeah.
But I mentioned this to you before, but the Lacanian Subject by Bruce Fink. It's a great introduction. Also, so I will say, if you want to read just pure Lacan, you can get into the Écrits, which is the kind of collection of writings that he had over the years. It was basically kind of like an anthology of a bunch of his really important essays from about his midpoint in his career. But it is, like he himself said, that it is almost impossible to read, and it is so tough. It is arguably the hardest book I've ever tried to read. and I've just read a couple essays from it. So I do think it's like a good experience to like try to do that, because like I based this whole part of the Graph of Desire on one essay in that. And there's still so much depth I'm sure I missed. But if you want to really get into reading Lacan specifically, I would say go for his seminars. He had basically a seminar for like 27 years where every year he'd do a different topic. So like I'm reading actually one of his early ones, Seminar 5, where he goes over the structure of the Graph of Desire, and he works through basically all of the dozens and dozens of different versions of the graph that he has building up to this final one that we see here on the screen. It's a bit long, it's like 500 pages, but it's much clearer than the Écrit. Like I can actually sit down, read through it, and parse out and make sense of most of it.
Yeah.
And then also, Zizek has a couple works. I would actually recommend, if you haven't already read it, read The Sublime Object of Ideology. It isn't explicitly an introduction to Lacan, but it is functionally very good for that. I forced my younger brother to read it, and he is making a lot more sense of a lot of Lacan. That's one of the ways I was introduced to him, other than the Écrit. Then, let's see. I think Alenka Zupajnik has a good book called What is Sex? Which is basically she's also one of those like Hegelian, Lacanian, Slovenian philosophers like Zizek. They're very close intellectually, and that kind of elaborates just more on like kind of the sexual dimension of Lacan. Yeah, I just got a new book also about the real. It's a bit expensive though, because it's like an academic publisher. It's by Tom Ayers. He's a professor at Duquesne. It's a short book. I'm planning on reading through it for my thesis. But yeah, if you have any specific like topics that you want to learn about, I would recommend just going through like all of the titles of Lacan's seminars, because like if you're interested in anxiety, he has like seminar 10 that's just about anxiety or something like that.
That's one I pulled up from his Amazon page
Yeah,
that I
yeah.
was curious about.
Okay, yeah. Let me know if you end up reading that, because I have that one and I would like to read through it at some point. So it'd be cool to read through it with someone. But yeah.
Sitting in my cart right now is a bunch of empiricist writings that I have been meaning to buy. It's from Locke, and then no, it's not. It's empiricists and rationalists. I was gonna go into their little debate because I saw Spinoza down there.
Oh, okay, yeah. Nice.
But yeah, that'll be fun. Even more money spent on books.
Yeah, no, seriously.
Do you think I could beat Smeagol in a riddle contest with this graph?
I don't even know how to parse that question.
Probably.
No, I'm also had your excellent presentation, El Presidente.
Thank you. Yeah, I'm glad you all enjoyed it. It was fun to put together, although a bit stressful. But I really enjoyed talking about this stuff. So yeah.
This is my one chance to get some understanding out of Lacan. So
yeah,
appreciate
it. All right.
Yeah, I can't always make it to campus, so it was fun to get to talk with you guys some.
Yeah, of course. It would be cool if we could keep like hybrid sessions going in the future. Although this is just a virtual one, but it would be nice. I don't know if technically it's going to always be the easiest thing to do though. But it is nice to just be able to give people more opportunities to come. So yeah, I'll stop streaming this because I don't need it.
Peace out, y'all.
See ya. Oh, and I can stop the recording.
See y'all.